Welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is the second half of our lecture on the 1920s, specifically the conservative backlash. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms on your left. Now, when we left off last time, we were talking about all these changes, right? Cars and consumer goods and new woman, the new Negro, jazz, all these things. And this was extremely upsetting to many people in America, all these changes at one time. And what we will see is a strong, staunch, conservative reaction that just wants to get back to Harding's promise of return to normalcy, the good old days. In this case, socially speaking, back to Victorian era ideals. Now, we're going to see a number of different things, including nativism. We're going to see a strong increase in nativism during the 1920s. Remember, we talked about the Red Scare before, this perception that there were so many communists and anarchists and other political radicals in this country that were all coming from foreign-born immigrants that created this strong prejudice against immigrants, against socialism and anarchism that were considered political philosophies that were decidedly un-American. And it all made people suspicious of people from other countries. Sound familiar? And so, in early 1920s, in 1921, when Harding takes over, immediately they pass what's called the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921. Now, there's two different acts here, right? There's the Emergency Immigration Act of 21, followed by the National Origins, aka the Johnson-Reed Act, aka the Immigration Act of 1924. Let's start with the Immigration Act of 21. So 1921, this was an emergency act that took effect in 1921. They said, okay, here's the problem. We have way too many immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. We don't like them. They're radicals, they're anarchists, they're communists, they're social, we hate them. How do we get rid of them legally? What they decided to do was to restrict immigration based on the country's national makeup or national origin. Let me explain this a different way. They went back to the 1910 U.S. Census, which at that point was kind of the most recent one, right? Because 1920 had just happened, didn't have the results yet. They went back to 1910. It made sense. And they said, okay, so we have 2 million people from Germany, we have 1 million people from Poland, we have 500,000 people from Serbia. And they said, okay, what we're going to do, we have this many people from these countries in 1910, based on the census. We're going to take 3% of every one of those numbers. And now that 3% number will be how many people we allow in the country from these countries every year. So there was 3 million Germans in our country, or more than that. 3 million Germans in our country in 1910. 3% of that number, that's how many people will be allowed in from Germany in 1922. That simple. That's what it means. However, unfortunately for these nativists, that is, this act did not have the full intended consequence. Because they said, no, wait. There are still too many darn people coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. We want to get rid of them. And so in 1924, they redid the Emergency Immigration Act of 21 and installed what became known as the very racist National Origins Act of 1924, aka the Johnson-Reed Act, named for its two principal creators, Johnson and Reed. What they did here was they reduced that 3% number down to 2%. Okay, fine. They want fewer immigration. Okay, I get that. But then they went back to 1890 U.S. Census to find out how many people from every country were in the United States in 1890 rather than 1910 or even 1920. What does this mean? Well, we talked about those new immigrants, right? That largely came in at the end of the 19th century. So 1890 was before that huge rise in Eastern and Southern immigration that took place right at the end of the century and the beginning of the 20th century. Thus, by doing this, we're able to sharply reduce the number of immigrants allowed in per year from Eastern and Southern Europe. Now, if you're a nativist or someone who's anti-immigrant, this is brilliant. But historically speaking, it's very racist. You are literally picking and choosing what countries you want to privilege. In doing so, based on the person's national origin, which is technically unfair because you don't get to choose where you're born at. You don't get to choose your nationality or the color of your skin. These are things that are just given to you by what are considered accidents of nature, right? You don't get to choose these things. But was it effective? Yeah. The 1924 Immigration Act, the National Origins Act, does have the intended consequence. The result is a sharp decline in immigration from Eastern and Western Europe. Now, there's a couple other things that were part of the National Origins Act and that were also enacted in and around this act. First of all, by the way, the National Origins Act will basically continue well into the 1960s as far as the implications of it. There are some other things added to it as well. They also instituted what became known as the LPC clause. Now, LPC is an acronym that stands for liable to become a public charge. In other words, are you someone that the immigration official, the border agent, whoever it is, feels that you, if you enter this country, are liable to become a pauper who's going to beg for food and rely on public assistance? So you become a public charge. Why is this important? Because again, it allows the Border Patrol to say, well, you don't look like somebody who can take care of yourself. You'll probably become a public charge. And it allows for discrimination based on color of skin, based upon your sex, whether you're male or female. Especially usually single women are never allowed in the country then because they're fair, they're women, so therefore they can't work, supposedly. And thus they're restricted. Again, LPC is very important going forward. Remember that term, LPC. Liable to become a public charge. Third thing, part of this act, it was the creation of the first National Border Patrol. And of course, the first members of the Border Patrol were none other than the Texas Rangers. Yes, the Texas Rangers who were known to willfully and illegally murder Mexicans just because they were in fact Mexican or of Mexican descent. They became the first Border Patrol agents here in Texas. Now, the thing is with the Border Patrols, the point of them was to prevent undocumented immigration. So their job was to prevent a person who crosses the border not through a port of entry like El Paso or Brownsville, but tries to cross through the desert or across the Rio Grande. That's the idea. However, an addendum to the Border Patrol gave the Border Patrol the authority to arrest suspected undocumented immigrants at their place of wherever it is. Not their entry points. They don't have to see you do the actual act. You're able to arrest suspected undocumented immigrants, take them to an immigration inspector without warrant, without a charge, that will allow them to then go back and find out if they are indeed documented or undocumented. So you can basically be rounded up on the basis of the fact that the Border Patrol agent just thinks you may look like an undocumented immigrant, arrest you without a warrant, hold you until they find out if you are truly a citizen or not, or here with a documentation or not. The thing is, though, they're able to do so anywhere in the United States. They can suspect you of being undocumented if you live in Detroit. Even though you are, if you say you're a Mexican or Mexican descent living in Detroit, 1,500 miles away from the Mexican border, but yet you are now seen as suspect. And the problem with this is it puts all immigrants under suspicion as being undocumented. It creates fear, it creates panic, and reinforces old nativist stereotypes. What is interesting about this act, though, is not only who it excluded and reduced, Asians and Europeans, but also who it allowed in the country. You see, despite this very harsh, restrictive act, excuse me, the Western Hemisphere was not part of it. They were excluded from the act entirely, meaning they could still travel to the United States without having a quota on them. There was no limit to the number of people from Western Hemisphere who could enter the country. Why? Well, the official response was, they're our neighbors and we like them. But if you take a deeper look at history of this very racist act, you will find it's not quite so simple. And it illustrates just how inextricably immigration policy and labor are tied. Now, you remember back in the 1917 Immigration Act with how Mexicans were temporarily offered the suspension of the head tax and literacy test? Remember that? Of course, it lasted for way past the war. And of course, and then 1921 comes around, that temporary program ends. Instead, we enacted an Emergency Immigration Act, which was also a year of economic downturn, and thus the United States began a massive deportation effort to round up Mexicans, put them on a train and send them back to Mexico. An estimated 50,000 Mexicans were sent, often under duress, back to Mexico during 1921, 1922. Now, did growers really care about this? And by the way, I'm using the term air quotes Mexican because sometimes there's just people of Mexican descent, some people who looked to have brown skin. They didn't always check for papers. Remember, just suspicion allowed the Border Patrol to pick you up. Now, growers didn't really make much of a fuss because of the recession in 21 and 22. But by 1924, the economy was booming, the roaring 20s, remember? And therefore, the problem now was the U.S. no longer had enough laborers to pick the fields again. And thus, by 1924, when the National Origins Act is passed, Mexico is excluded from the quota system. Because just like 1917, agribusiness made sure they were actively campaigning for Mexico to be excluded from the quota system. And it happened. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not for a lack of trying. In fact, one very racist Texas representative by the name of John Box would introduce 3 separate bills into Congress trying to get at least Mexico, if not the entire Western Hemisphere, on a quota system. In both 1926 and 1928, there will be days of testimony. So here's the 1921 repatriation. But by 1924, there are these various bills introduced to Congress by Representative John Box. 1926 bill has more than 350 pages of transcript. This is the short one. Because in 1928, the transcript is over 800 pages long. And yours truly has read most of all these pages. And when you read through these documents, it's fascinating. Because what's interesting of note is that no matter if the speaker who was testifying was either for or against adding Mexico to the quota system, it doesn't matter which way they're for or against it. The words they used helped answer the following question. Were Mexicans accepted as possibly good Americans and or U.S. citizens? And the answer, of course, is no. Whether or not they were for or against adding Mexico to the quota system, both sides were racist. In fact, one of the most common lines said was, I know the Mexican. The Mexican is this. And the Mexican, it's always the Mexican. I have no idea why. But reading through these bills, these introduced proposed legislation, it's almost like reading a horror story of how badly humanity can treat other human beings. So the answer is no. All Mexicans were seen as was cheap, disposable labor. That's all they were. In other words, our immigration policy was inextricably tied to labor concerns. Which, of course, then, how was the language used then part of Hoover's idea of return to normalcy? Because they were using Mexicans, Mexican laborers, Mexican field laborers, the same way the Gilded Age treated factory workers. They are cheap, disposable, replaceable commodities that can be bought, sold, traded, gotten rid of, discarded when they're no longer of use. In other words, Gilded Age principles return to normalcy. Business interests trump human life and well-being. And our immigration policy reflected that, especially when it comes to, well, Mexicans. Another big issue, of course, was the eugenic problem I talked about earlier with Margaret Sanger. Remember that? But what is eugenics? See, eugenics is this pseudoscience of so-called better race breeding, right? So the idea was that if we want to make America great and be a great country, maybe what we should do is use science to breed better population of people. In other words, you know how, like we talked about, if you took first out of U.S. history, I taught my very first lecture, talked about how people chose the best, juiciest ear of corn, it was this tiny, to then plant and grow to make it a little bit bigger. And then over 100 years, the ear of corn went from being this big to, of course, our standard ear of corn, which is now huge, right? So, selective breeding. Well, they were trying to apply that in the 1920s to humans, to breed a better race of people. And what they argued in those congressional transcripts for adding these right here, one of the things that was argued against Mexican immigration was that Mexicans were quote-unquote hyperbreeders that basically reproduced like rabbits. And that if we didn't stop their immigration, they would overrun the country and take America away from white people. This was argued in these transcripts. And thus, especially in California, eugenics was popular. It was big. And a number of prominent eugenicists will actually testify in those transcripts I told you about. But what ends up being is the health departments, local health departments throughout the country would employ eugenic pseudoscience to forcibly sterilize groups of people. For example, if someone was, say, a lunatic or insane or mentally unstable or mentally retarded, you didn't want that person to reproduce and procreate because their odds are, according to them, they were going to produce someone who was just like them, who was morally, mentally unstable. And who you want to produce is, well, the capitalist class, the business class. And so what happens is they began the forcible sterilization of groups of people. Yes, those who were insane, true. Those who were morally decrepit, true. But they also been applying this because, remember, they didn't want Mexicans to overrun the white race, even though legally Mexicans are white. And so in places like California, they began to do things that were hideous, horrendous. Things like when a Mexican woman went in to give birth to her child. Now, back in the 1920s and through the 1950s, husbands didn't go with them. You went in by yourself. A woman was dropped off, she went in by herself. So you got to picture this. A Mexican woman, or Mexican-American woman, is taken in. She may or may not speak English. Either way, she is definitely under duress. She's in labor. It's painful. My wife's been through it twice. I've been with her for both times. It is painful. So you're being carried into the delivery room. You have to sign paperwork because you're the only one there. And the doctor is telling you things in English that you may or may not understand. And don't forget, whether you understand English or not, you're under duress. And the doctor is saying things to you like, hey, we're going to, fix you up after you deliver the baby. And what he means by that is he's going to tie your tubes or prevent you from ever sterilize you. Or he'll make you sign a piece of paper that, of course, you're in labor, you're under duress. Again, you may or may not be able to read it. You may not understand English, maybe not. But either way, you sign a piece of paper that says, oh, yeah, we'll deliver your baby and we're going to sterilize you. And thousands of Mexican and Mexican-American women are sterilized, not even knowing it. African-American women, they were brought before a court and they were told, come here, come approach the bench. And they would stand there in front of the bench, and on the other side of the wood would be an x-ray machine. They would click, and basically an x-ray machine will fry a woman's reproductive system. That was the thought. And again, these eugenic ideas would prevail in America, 1920s. And while they went out of style by the 1940s, some states will continue them into the 1960s, 1970s. Places like Virginia, for instance. But what's fascinating here, and the reason it goes out of style, out of vogue in the 1940s, is because who was a big fan of the United States eugenic program? Hitler. Adolf Hitler was enamored with California and the U.S. eugenic policies, our pseudoscience, right? And think about it. He took it evilly, terribly, rotten hell. He took it to an extreme where he says, okay, well, fine. If we don't want to breed out these bad races, supposedly, let's just kill them right now and not let them reproduce. Hence, gas chambers. And of course, all these immigrants, whether it's the Mexicans coming from Mexico or whether it's these paired back on these European immigrants, all the small numbers of Asian immigrants still coming. This nativism will also spur a spark of a resurgence of the KKK. We will have now the second round of the KKK. Now, the second KKK, 1920s, was much larger and much more mainstream than the one of the 1870s. Because they were back, they were worse than ever, and they were pretty much equal opportunity haters. Yes, they still hated African Americans. They were still hell-bent on protecting white American society, but now, not only from African Americans, but from Jews, from Roman Catholics, and from other immigrants that they deemed undesirable. The founder of the second KKK was William J. Simmons. And you see his quote here, "America is a garbage can. It's not a melting pot. When the hordes of aliens walk to the ballot box and their votes outnumber yours, then that alien horde has got you by the throat." And so they became, and again, there's quite evidence that Henry Ford was a secret member of the KKK, but you see here, they're not hiding here. They're marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. They are open, they're loud, they're proud. In 1915, the second round of the KKK is founded, resurgence. And by the 1920s, it's a national organization of hate. This is not a fringe organization. It's as everyday mainstream as the Boy Scouts, who would use ritualized lynchings as a rite of passage. Anyways, everyone from all walks of life belonged to the KKK. Clergymen, engineers, accountants, small businessmen, managers, store owners, politicians. They would walk around and light crosses on fire in people's yards again. Membership, it's hard to determine how many really belong to them because there aren't always official books and they're very secretive in their books. But somewhere between 3 and 8 million members during the 1920s. The only thing that caused the KKK, second round KKK, or KKK 2.0 to fizzle out was the passage of the 1924 National Origins Act. Because basically it did what they wanted. It got rid of all the immigrants they didn't want, except for Mexicans. Don't worry, they'll be back for 3.0 in the 1940s and 50s. In addition to all this chaos and upheaval, the nativism, all these other issues, as society modernized, there had a profound effect on churches and religion. And as society modernized, this began to influence churches heavily. Many started to believe that maybe the Bible should be criticized. Maybe we should find a way to reconcile the Bible with science, including Darwin's theory of evolution. For example, maybe if you read the Bible, the first book, Genesis, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period. And then you go to Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 2, and it says, and God created, or then God said, let there be light. And it says, God formed the earth. Well, if you look in the original translations of this, there's some evidence to support that it says God reformed, refashioned the earth. And so maybe, just maybe, you can reconcile evolution in the Bible by saying there's a gap of perhaps millions of years between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 1, verse 2. Maybe. I'm not saying that's the answer, but I'm saying this is a possibility. And so there were some that said we should reconcile the Bible with Darwin's theory of evolution in science. However, many Orthodox Christian churches, Protestant Christians, began to embrace the opposite way, called fundamentalism, or as they called the literal reading and interpretation of Scripture. And this took the country by storm. Remember, during times of tremendous upheaval, there's often religious revival. We had the First and Second Great Awakening. In this case, though, they kind of go the other direction. Rather than try to progress, they kind of fall back and they want to reaffirm their Christian roots, fundamentalism. Now, one of the most prominent fundamentalist Christian leaders of this point was our old friend, you guessed it, William Jennings Bryan. He's back. Now, he has some of a kind of a cult following, and he became a powerful voice of the against evolution being taught in public schools. In fact, in 1921, he began a campaign for laws to prohibit the teaching of evolution in public schools. And many state legislators would consider these bills, and some in the South actually agreed. In fact, in a very famous case, the climax of this case came in Tennessee in 1925. So in a city known as Dayton, Tennessee, in 1925, they had passed a law that forbade the teaching of evolution in schools. So no Darwin, no evolution. Now, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, wanted to challenge this law as being unconstitutional, etc. So they found a teacher by the name of John Scopes. He was a science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, and they challenged him saying, hey, you teach evolution as a science teacher would, and when you go to trial, we will represent you, we will support you, we will pay for your defense. Basically, the idea was defy the law and bring it to a trial, make the court decide. Well, this happens. This is a test case. John Scopes does it, and we get a trial that received national, even worldwide headlines. It became known as the Scopes monkey trial, because John Scopes, and of course monkey, we descended from apes, evolution. And so during this trial, it was a very circus-like affair, because during the trial, a lawyer from Chicago by the name of Clarence Darrow is going to defend John Scopes. Got a picture of them right here. There's Clarence Darrow. And Williams Jennings Bryan offered his services to the prosecution. So you have Williams Jennings Bryan, the champion of fundamentalist Christians, against Clarence Darrow, a confessed agnostic lawyer from Chicago. Now, the courtroom scene was quite dramatic, made for Hollywood. The judge, first of all, ruled that the inclusion of scientific testimony would not be allowed. Yes, in a court case about evolution in science, the judge ruled that any scientific testimony will not be allowed. Yeah. But the judge did allow William Jennings Bryan to be called as an expert witness in biblical interpretation. And so, Bryan is called to the witness stand, and Clarence Darrow is going to cross-examine him. And he and Darrow are going to square off in a conversation in which William Jennings Bryan will say that he believes Jonah was literally swallowed by a big fish, and that the earth was literally created in 4000 BC. To which Darrow replied, quote, "These are fool ideas that no intelligent Christian on earth believes," unquote. And I haven't gotten the good stuff yet. Because in the climax of this, Darrow and Bryan lunged at each other, breaking into a fist fight on the courtroom floor, causing the court to adjourn. Scopes was found guilty and sentenced to a fine, and Williams Jennings Bryan, our old friend, will die shortly thereafter of a heart attack. And you can't say that the fight caused it, but it surely didn't help. Now, this is also a legacy. So again, this legacy, this conservative fundamentalist reaction to the issues in the plights and the changes of the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. One more legacy of the progressive movement that made its way in the 1920s, of course, was Prohibition. And remember, I'm not going to dwell on this too deeply. We talked about this already in the progressive talk. But this is a legacy of the progressive era. And this temperance movement really gained steam in the early 20th century, particularly at the end of World War I, because people were drinking a lot. And finally, we will pass the 18th Amendment, which will create prohibition in our country. Essentially, it's a nationwide ban on the sale and consumption of alcohol. And again, so that's why it's considered a progressive amendment, because this is using the government to regulate and reform, right? That's the idea. And so, sure enough, the 18th Amendment is passed. We will create prohibition, no more alcohol in our country. Unfortunately, this one is not exactly effective. So again, 18th Amendment you see here, 1 year after ratification, the manufacture, sale, transportation of intoxicating liquor is banned, prohibited. The problem is it was not effective. Because even though this kind of thing would appeal or start appearing on doors, no one really listened. Now, yes, cops would do roundups, but what happens instead was this. The creation of bootlegging. People would use bathtubs to brew their own alcohol, to distill their own liquor. Smugglers would smuggle it across the country from the backwoods of the Smoky Mountains into the urban centers. There were secret nightclubs known as speakeasies. Now, speakeasies were secret nightclubs that appeared like otherwise normal-looking stores. They were pet shops, tea houses, cellars, office buildings, and basically they're called speakeasy because you had your storefront in the front, then you had a wall, and then in the back of it was the drinking area. So people were partying and drinking. The problem is you had to speak easy, quietly, otherwise the authorities might hear you. But the thing is, people made millions off supplying liquor. Now in Michigan, I grew up in Michigan, and down in Detroit, it's just across the river from Canada, and where Canada was still a wet country. You could get alcohol there. And so you would often have bootleggers running across into Canada to bring booze back into Detroit. What made it even more exciting was during the wintertime, the Detroit River freezes over. So there would actually be car chases with the police chasing after the bootleggers and smugglers across the ice in their cars. Down here in Texas, you had people crossing the Mexican border, basically cowboys and horses, and also cars, driving across the border, not to bring undocumented immigrants, but to bring booze. And people made millions because people like Al Capone figured that he made over $60 million supplying alcohol. Now, what's fascinating about this was one of the reasons you wanted to ban alcohol was because it was said if you ban alcohol, because people do stupid things when they're drunk, so you ban alcohol, you get rid of crime. The irony is, yeah, basic petty crime decreased, but what did increase was organized crime. People like Al Capone, these organized gangs, they became bigger problems, using the Tommy guns and the shootouts against the police. And even some very now famous people, like the Kennedy family, it is said they made the most of their money as a family by bootlegging and selling booze illegally during Prohibition, which of course allows the family to become rich, allows them to send their sons to the best schools, and of course they will eventually become president, John F. Kennedy. Oh, by the way, fun fact, there was another speakeasy that everyone knew about. In fact, a place that never went dry was the White House. They had their own bar. Always went. Now, this was, of course, deemed a massive failure, and of course, on December 5th, 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt will repeal the 18th Amendment by signing the 21st Amendment to repeal Prohibition. I love this image. He's drinking alcohol while he's signing the bill. Perfect image. So between nativists, the KKK, fundamentalists, and Prohibition, people were wanting to turn back the clock and hold on to a 19th century society that was slipping through their fingers. Because the reality is there was no going back. Now, economically speaking, things will go back a little bit, but socially and culturally, everything has changed. The economy is technically booming, but isolationism, laissez-faire style governments, lack of regulation, and a lack of environmentalism are going to come back to haunt. When we get to our next lecture on, of course, the Great Depression. But until then, let's be happy for a minute and enjoy this last image. Next time, we'll get depressed. But until then, take care and bye-bye.